As the world enters a new era of nuclear strategy, the stakes have never been higher. Nuclear weapons, symbols of global tension and competition, are at the forefront of international security concerns. With these nations accelerating their nuclear capabilities, the challenge to maintain peace and prevent a return to Cold War dynamics is critical. How do we enhance deterrence while avoiding escalation? This panel will address innovative strategies for contemporary nuclear challenges. We'll explore balancing robust deterrence with effective diplomacy to adapt to new global threats and maintain stability. Join us to confront the complexities of nuclear modernization and find a path towards a stable and peaceful international order.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is my distinct honor to share this panel with my four colleagues here, Amy, Barbara, Łukasz, and Paul. And we will try to address, to the best of our ability, a very complex nuclear landscape. As we're all aware, Russia has been modernizing its nuclear strategic and non-strategic forces for the last 2 decades. Steadily, China has been expanding its ICBM silo-based force in recent years. DPRK has been diversifying its nuclear as well as non-nuclear offensive capabilities, and Iran, despite the attempts of the international community, is very close to the nuclear threshold, as we have been. In adding pain to injury, we have seen Russia and North Korea turning nuclear deterrence, which we in the West invented, against us as a tool of intimidation and coercion. And because of that belligerent behavior, we are being intimidated by them. So they are turning the tables on us. And the nuclear deterrence, in effect, is being moved from its intended purpose to really try to change the facts on the ground through psychology. And the Russians are very good at this. They understand that nuclear weapons are weapons of terror, and therefore this is adding to our challenge in dealing with this very complex nuclear landscape, much more complex than it was at the end of the Cold War 30 years ago. So the three Western nuclear powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, have really the work cut out for them. And we are very fortunate to have with us 4 experts that are going to look at these issues this morning. And I will start with Amy to have her address these issues from the standpoint of the United States and what can the United States do to its nuclear posture to strengthen its deterrence, but also to strengthen the extended deterrence commitments that the United States has worldwide. Amy.
Thank you. First, I want to thank PISM for inviting me to be here. I've been to Warsaw before, but I've never been to the Strategic Arc, so I'm really pleased to be here. Second, I'd like to point out that I'm speaking for myself, not for any of my current or past affiliations. I am certainly not speaking for the U.S. government. So, with that, when Diego sent me questions, he asked if the United States should increase its nuclear forces to help ensure that our deterrence and extended deterrence commitments remain credible in the changing landscape. And I have a short answer and a long answer. My short answer is that the United States should increase its forces, i.e. the number of deployed nuclear warheads, if there is a military requirement to do so. Deterrence is a psychological mind game, but meeting your military requirements is a question of weapons and targets. So basically, if we need to increase the numbers of weapons, that's a military requirement question. As to the broader question of what we should do to enhance deterrence, or particularly extended deterrence, I would have to turn the question back on the allies. I mean, I cannot tell you what makes deterrence credible to the allies. They would have to tell me. And credibility is more than just about numbers. It's about the strength of the U.S. commitment, the U.S. responsibility to its allies, and the allies' willingness to trust the United States with that commitment. That being said, there's a lively conversation going on in the United States right now about the size and structure of the U.S. nuclear force. In particular, the question focuses on what we should do in terms of numbers and types of weapons to respond to the Russian and Chinese forces in a two-peer environment. So basically, the question boils down to whether the United States needs more nuclear weapons because we now have two nations with whom we are in a deterrent relationship, which means two nations with targets we would want to be able to address. Again, it's the military requirement. Now, the scope of this debate covers the full ground from no, we don't need to change our forces to, oh, yes, we need lots and lots more, but it settles somewhere in the middle. Last year at the Arms Control Association's annual meeting in June, Jake Sullivan, the President's National Security Advisor, said that reminded everyone that the United States is replacing its entire nuclear triad in something we call the Program of Record. And he did not forswear increases in that program, but he did say that the United States does not need to increase our nuclear forces to outnumber the combined total of our competitors. So some numbers up, yes, not twice as much as everybody else, or even equal to or more than everybody else. You may have heard of the Strategic Posture Commission, which was a congressionally mandated bipartisan panel, released a report last fall. They addressed the same issue. They also said that the program of record is absolutely essential, but it's not sufficient to meet the new threats posed by Russia and China, and that the program of record should be completed on time, expedited wherever possible, and expanded as needed. So again, there's this growing sense that there may be a need, likely a need, to expand the size and scope of the U.S. nuclear arsenal to meet the military challenges. This is not about enhancing the credibility of our deterrent. This is about enhancing the military capability. If you want to focus specifically on reassuring the allies, the best example we have recently is about a year ago. The United States and the Republic of Korea signed something known as the Washington Declaration. And the Republic of Korea has been very nervous about its nuclear neighborhood and has been somewhat interested in acquiring or reacquiring U.S. nuclear capability on the peninsula. And the United States does not see a military requirement to do that, but certainly sees a need to enhance the credibility of our reassurances to South Korea. So the Washington Declaration calls for enhanced consultations, cooperation, exercises, port visits. It's a sense to demonstrate to the South Koreans physically what our weapons can do for them, even if they are not placed on the peninsula. And that's the essence of extended deterrence and reassurance. The guarantees are less about where the weapons are than about whether we would be committed to using them on the behalf of another country, even if the retaliation might come towards us. And that has always been the underlying concern in NATO throughout the Cold War. The question of whether the United States, when faced with Soviet or now Russian retaliation that could affect the United States, whether or not we would stand by our commitments to our allies. So I can see three reasons to change the U.S. nuclear posture in Europe: new weapons, new types. The first one, as I've said multiple times, is if there's a military requirement, changing of the employment guidance or the targeting base, if we need more weapons to do what we need to do. Right now, I don't see that, but that's what's under debate in the United States. Maybe we've changed our estimates of what Russian goals are. We've certainly had to do that in the last couple of years. And whether we need responses to further enhance our deterrent of Russia. That's less a military requirement question than the question of what Russia considers credible from our response. And the third is, I think, the question you asked me to get to originally. I'll get there. Changing estimates of our own consideration for our allies. Do the allies need to hear, see, or have us do more for them? And as I said, reassuring our allies and extending deterrence is not about weapons. It's about the credibility of our commitment. So finally, my opinion, and it probably won't sit well in this room. Nuclear weapons are not a magic bullet. Bringing new delivery capabilities to the theater won't provide a sudden change in the threat environment or a sudden solution to the Allies' concerns about the U.S. commitment. I have particular concerns in bringing nuclear weapons to the theater about the crisis stability implications. If we can reach the targets that we need to reach in support of our allies without creating lucrative and vulnerable targets for the Russians to look at, I would prefer to do that. So putting more weapons on European soil, particularly doing so in places that are relatively close to Russia, does not appeal to me. You may have a different opinion. But finally, I'd like to make one critical point. If you are really concerned about the commitment the United States has to our allies, and you think we need to do something to bolster that commitment, please don't think we can bring you new weapons anytime soon. As I mentioned, we have a rather extensive program of record to rebuild our entire nuclear triad. We only have so much industrial capacity for both the delivery systems and the warheads. So if you want bright, shiny new weapons, you can get in line. If you want commitment and guarantees and assurances from the United States, we can use other political and military mechanisms to bring that to you much more quickly than we can bring shiny weapons.
Thank you for that. Let me just follow up on one point. And I think we all recognize in this room there are physical constraints on how much the United States can do in terms of modernizing its forces. Yeah, there are budgets, there are physical constraints on weapons production and so on. But from the late 1950s to the late 1980s, the United States had a full range of non-strategic nuclear weapons in Europe. Today we have a manned component that is a collective one between the United States and several allies. But there isn't much between that and then the strategic nuclear forces. Do you foresee that there could be an agreement in NATO to begin filling that gap, even if it takes time because of these physical constraints?
I don't see it as a gap, unless there's a military requirement. Everybody wants to know about the sea-launched nuclear-armed cruise missile. 2035, it should be ready if you want to wait. It's the center of the debate about the need to expand the U.S. delivery system capability. And there are advocates who believe it is the only way to bring more capability to Europe. Why? Because it would be at sea, and we've all, well, most of us remember the INF years and the debates about putting more missiles on European territory. I mean, I ought to ask you, do you want 7,000 nuclear weapons in Europe again? I don't think so. I know, but that's where we were before we started pulling them back. So if you think there is a single point solution, first, I don't see a military gap, but I'm not on the side of the debate that thinks the sea-launched cruise missile is absolutely necessary. I see military requirements that could be bolstered with additional capabilities. A single point solution would give you a sea-launched cruise missile. Other solutions would be helpful. Air-launched cruise missiles, do they need to be based on European territory? I don't know. I haven't seen the military requirements. But we have other capabilities available in the nearer term, so you don't have to wait till 2035, that could be brought to bear if there is a military requirement. I don't want to keep emphasizing that point. But if you're looking for reassurance that the United States will be here for NATO, I don't think you should focus solely on whether we bring hardware.
Thank you very much. This provides a good background and transition point to Łukasz to look at this issue of extended deterrence from a collective NATO and European standpoint. Łukasz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I will try to provide a case of sorts for an adaptation of the nuclear posture in Europe, even though I'm not an enthusiast of new, shiny nuclear weapons being deployed anywhere. Actually started my career at PISM 20 years ago, writing a short piece arguing that it's time to remove US nuclear weapons from Europe and keep the alliance strong. Obviously, that's not a piece that I would write today, but 2003, 2004, that's where I thought we were heading, rather towards limiting the role of nuclear weapons than strengthening them. Unfortunately, we are where we are. And I think it's important to note that the nuclear sharing arrangements and the stationing of US nuclear bombs in Europe is part of a larger construct. It's almost like a Russian doll in which you have the nuclear sharing, which is part of NATO's nuclear posture, which is part of NATO's overall deterrence and defense posture that also includes non-nuclear aspects, which itself is part of NATO's overall approach to everything. So we need to be careful about just talking about one single thing without having the knowledge about the linkages to anything else. But yes, I think there is a case also to think about moving to adaptation of NATO's nuclear posture. That includes some adaptation of NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements. And these arrangements are no longer unique after Russia did the kind of nuclear sharing on its own with Belarus, but they are pretty singular. So US deploying nuclear weapons on the territory of selected European countries, these countries training, preparing for the use of nuclear weapon, joint planning, plus the possibility, if we have a war, for the nuclear mission to be executed not by the US aircraft, but by the Allied aircraft. Pretty unique thing. Then there is this aspect that I think Elaine Bunn called the marriage rings of the alliance. So the symbolic, part of the symbolic linkages between the United States and European allies. So there is a lot there. And I think it's worth keeping. Drivers of adaptation, first and foremost, Russia. The Russian threat, that includes their arsenal, which they are modernizing in a way that is different from the United States, especially in the non-strategic domain, but it's constantly being modernized or renewed. Then the doctrine and then the intimidation and the attempts for assertive coercion operating under the nuclear shadow in the context of its aggression against Ukraine. And indeed the Russian deployment to Belarus, which I think also needs to be taken into account. The second issue, you call it the military requirement. I would go a little bit broader, the credibility and ability of NATO to actually conduct a nuclear mission if called for. Which includes the number of aircraft, number of warheads, the whole system that supports a nuclear mission. So that's the second part, which I think needs to be adapted a little bit because we are, in a sense, operating on something that was inherited from the 1990s and wasn't really a careful design, but rather, what was left there after the major reductions of the post-Cold War era. Then the third issue, I think time for a more equal sharing of the burden and the risks connected with the nuclear mission in an enlarged alliance, a very much enlarged alliance of 2024. more European participation probably would also be good in the context of this debate about burden sharing in general. So maybe making space for some of the US non-nuclear assets to be removed to other theaters if necessary. And then the last issue, the issue of signaling. Signaling to our own populations, signaling to our enemies. There was a time that NATO was almost ashamed to have a nuclear posture. I think it's time to move on for that. Adaptation, I think very short-term things that we are already doing. Something that in the NATO parlance is called raising the nuclear IQ. So making sure that everybody understands what nuclear deterrence and the uses of misuses of nuclear weapons are about, and what is the actual NATO position. Then the hardware part. So we are in the process of modernization of moving to the F-35 B-61 bomb combination. Also adaptation of the nuclear command and control system. But that's what is going on anyway. I think there is a case to move beyond that. Short to mid-term adaptation. One, nuclear sharing. I think there is a case to be made not necessarily for more places where nuclear weapons are stored, but maybe for more countries to be engaged as DCA providing nations. Then better integration of what we do in the nuclear domain with everything else, what's going on. Of course, nuclear planning and NATO is a dirty word for the French. C'est interdit. So it's not possible to do that. So that's why France is out of the nuclear planning group. But there might be a ways to actually bring the nuclear, conventional, and everything in between closer. Then adopting to the lessons from this war regarding things like the survivability of our assets, resilience. Do we see our nuclear assets being in the bases that officially nobody knows where they are, but informally you can pinpoint on Google Maps where the bunkers are. So what's the plan to disperse these assets during a crisis or a war, for example? Things to tackle. And the very last thing, very long term, 2035, 2040 context, what happens after the current modernization of our hardware? Are we talking about air launch systems, sea launch systems? Yes, the perspective is very long, but at least we should start the discussion about it now.
Łukasz, thank you very much for that. Let me follow up, and I will ask you to provide a short answer to my question. But Amy mentioned that in addition to operational capacity, deterrence is very much based on credibility, on the credibility of the provider and of the receiving allies, that they will actually respond to aggression. Now, would you think that the credibility of NATO's nuclear posture would be improved if we also improved our long-range conventional strike capabilities? That is, we call these aircraft dual-capable, conventional and nuclear. Should we, under NATO, have sort of nuclear sharing arrangements like for conventional long-range missiles? So you are not only dependent on nuclear response, but you have a strong conventional strike capability.
Definitely yes, because still I think in NATO's interest is to think about a possible nuclear option as really maybe not a last resort, but something that wouldn't be the first and the early choice in a war on the NATO side. Maybe we'll be forced to do that, hopefully not. But that also means that in responding to any crisis or an attack, we would need to have a better conventional options. And long-range strike is one of the ways to actually increase deterrence by punishment of our adversaries.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, this is a nice transition to Paul's intervention. There's been a lot of talk in recent months about the European contribution to overall nuclear deterrence by the alliance. We are all aware of the 1974 Ottawa Declaration about the French contribution to alliance deterrence. We're aware about the idea of what the French call dissuasion concertée, which President Chirac raised at, in about 1996. We have heard President Macron. We're aware of the bilateral agreements under the Lancaster House treaties of 2010 and the framework for British-French cooperation. Against that complex background, Paul, could you lead us a little bit into where could the French-British nuclear cooperation go as a complement rather than, of course, any kind of substitute for what NATO provides? But is there any room? Is there a requirement for that? Or is this a bad idea?
I think it depends on the French.
Your mic, please.
It depends rather what President Macron has in mind, which has still to be turned on. Is that working now? It depends on President Macron. What is the behind the latest French formulation about their approach to France's role in alliance deterrence and France's particular national deterrent intentions. So this is to be revealed. I think the British have traditionally been receptive to those to French suggestions, but within the limits of declaring our main deterrent essentially to NATO. If there's a way which is proposed which could make our joint deterrence more worked into a wider NATO concept of deterrence, I imagine the British governments would go for that. But I don't know what's proposed or what the limits of French width of comprehension would be. I do think that there's not going to be any magic solution, rather as Amy pointed out, about hardware. We are maxed out. The British have got an ambitious nuclear modernization program, and there's no room. It's not just about money, it's about industrial capacity for changing what is going to be built. We're building new boats, weapons associated with them, and it's also a problem of technology. Each successive generation is more difficult. The requirements for safety, the requirements for silence are more exacting. So building a state-of-the-art modern fleet is difficult, and there's no major room for changing it. Whatever diplomatic formulations may be worked out between London and Paris and within NATO. So that would be my major point. Don't expect too much. And don't expect that tough-sounding declarations are going to make much of a difference. British politicians, French politicians could say more, but I don't think that's going to carry much weight with the Russians. Some kinds of signalling don't carry much conviction, and there's no magic solution. So that's my overall point on that particular question.
Yeah, but we all know where we have been coming from in terms of the US, the UK, and the French nuclear forces, going back to the 1960s. And we know there are physical constraints as well as political conditions attached to all of that. But at the same time, the nuclear world we're looking at of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran is unlike anything we have seen before. So it seems to me that we can no longer just look at NATO's nuclear posture and the contributions of the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, each in their own way, the same way we used to look at before. And it seems to me that the three nuclear powers of the alliance, plus the other 29 members of the alliance, need to have a much more open-minded conversation about what it is going to take for these three nations, together with the other 29 allies, to ensure that we have credible deterrence vis-à-vis these four powers all around the globe. So this is a very different kind of nuclear world than the one that, let's say, the NPG was looking in 1979 with the INF decision, or even the 87 world with the INF treaty, or even later decisions about scaling back U.S. nuclear forces in Europe. We're in a really new ballgame, and it seems to me that we need to be much more open-minded and imaginative than we have been to date. What do you think?
Yeah, and the predicament is more complicated even than you mentioned. It's about the mood within the alliance, its ability to have an open-minded discussion. And here, I think the terms we've been given, nuclear fear, are not quite right. I mean, it's a reference to Karaganov's suggestion that Russia should deliberately re-inject nuclear fear into the relationship. But I think what I see around me, because Warsaw is a great place to watch the alliance in microcosm, is nuclear anxiety. Fear is an acute emotion. It propels you to make changes, to fight or flight. Anxiety is a paralyzing long-term emotion, and that's what I see prevalent within the alliance, and it gets in the way of creativity. It suppresses a lot of factors, and I wonder if we're talking about it in the right way. I've been struck here by the sort of depressive mood, and here I should point out this is not an ideal speech situation. I'm glad to be here, but there's something paradoxical about discussing the politics and psychology of nuclear deterrence, particularly when subjected to nuclear intimidation. A full discussion would get into distrust, vulnerabilities, uncertainties within the alliance, and I don't want to talk about that here, which might, because we're going to be transmitted, as I understand it, and I don't want to give more precise impressions of the vulnerabilities of the alliance to people who would want to use it against us. This is not just a listening post, it's a transmission point. This is an important discussion. I've usually been in discussions like this before, in classified or private circumstances, and something changes if we have it in public. But it is necessary to point out that we're not very good at coping with the anxiety that the Russians are putting on it. And they have a very worked-out doctrine for doing it. They've been thinking since 1917 about how to hold back, understandably questionable or hostile Western countries who outnumber them demographically and industrially. And they want to try and paralyze our ability to respond to this situation. And they're doing it quite well. This connects with psychiatric ideas like depression, which I saw exhibited, and intrapunitive behavior. We blame each other rather than the people who are really intimidating us. It gets to ideas like moral injury. We are failing to do what we know we ought to be doing to respond to aggression, which is fairly clear-cut. And that's got all kinds of consequences. It gets in the way of proper discussion. And this is all part of not just a psychiatric, but a military doctrine conversation. The Russians have a concept of sturjevanie, of deterrence in the mind. They would like to make it impossible, just unbearably dangerous and anxiety-provoking, to talk about what's necessary to resist Russian intentions, so that the discussions last night would be impossible. If the Russian psychological warfare, what they call the informational psychological field of information operations, if that was successful, we wouldn't be talking about what's necessary to do. It's not necessarily going to be successful, but there's going to be a lot of it. It will be aided by botnets and useful idiots and high-minded members of the disarmament archipelago in the West. So having this conversation is going to be difficult, but it will be impossible in public.
Yes. And thank you for reminding us of all those psychological aspects of deterrence, both as they're seen from our adversaries, but also the implications for ourselves. Yeah. And unless you have witnessed the exceptional Soviet nuclear exercise of June 1982, where the Soviet Union went through the full execution of a worldwide nuclear war, and maybe remembers the most threatening exercise of all times, maybe you don't get the sense of how far the Russians can go down this scale.
Yeah, that's part of nuclear anxiety. You worry about the transition to full-on nuclear fear. NATO leaders, particularly in Europe, do not want to return to the anxieties of the Euromissile crisis, where there are thousands of marching on the streets and coalition governments begin to totter. So having the ability to create nuclear fear is one of the Russian reserve capabilities, and European, especially European statesmen, I guess it's true in North America too, are aware of that and would rather not have to go there.
Thank you for that. I think we have been discussing the capacity and credibility aspects with Amy and the arrangements with Łukasz and the psychological relationships, the rings within the alliance, which are all quite important. I would like now to turn to Barbara to cover the last pillar of this conversation, which is arms control and disarmament. And we in the West can pride ourselves in that record, all the way back from the NPT through the SALT and START negotiations, from MBFR to CFE and CDE. I mean, we have been the parents of arms control and disarmament for the last 50 years. So we have no fear in terms of our credibility or commitment to that. But we are in a different world with many of these treaties having been overcome by developments in the geopolitics of the world. Can you give us a sense of where we go from here, given a little bit of the despair that we have experienced with all of that? Is there still a role for arms control and disarmament? And if there is, what is it? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And the short answer, I believe, is yes, but let me expand. And let me start by reminding everybody here that the main theme for this conference is the art of winning, and that it is, I believe, really crucial to remember that in the nuclear domain, winning means nuclear war never taking place. You do not win nuclear wars. And I think that is a starting point that I would have considered self-evident, but given that, for example, yesterday we were asked to consider giving war a chance, this deserves really stating explicitly. The idea is to prevent further escalation of this conflict and to make sure that nuclear war does not happen. The task at hand, as I think Director Dembski put it very, very well in his opening remarks yesterday, is managing a relationship that is confrontational in nature. And I think the managing part of this is really crucial. And so, as I said, the main task for now is to prevent that this escalates further and that we end up in a war. There are many ways to classify wars, but I think one really useful way of classifying wars in our context here is to say that there are intended wars and there are unintended wars. Now, arms control is not going to help you much in the case of intended wars. That is what deterrence is for, right? Deterrence aims at changing the calculations of the other side, raising the stakes, and thereby, based on the idea that the other side is actually interested in its own survival, will think twice about starting a war. So that much about intended wars. What deterrence cannot do is prevent unintended wars, just escalation that starts from something maybe just a minor incident and that just spirals down. And this is where arms control comes into the picture. So granted, arms control is not going to prevent intended wars, but then again, deterrence, which we are putting in place, and rightly so, I believe, also means that the risk for unintended wars are actually growing, which has to do with the postures we adopt, the signaling we do, the exercises we do, and so on and so forth. And so, again, this is the reason why arms control really does have a role to play in this context, based on the idea that there is a mutual interest in actually avoiding this escalation, and also, in a sense, the possibility, as we did in the Cold War, to compartmentalize both risk reduction measures, but also more broadly a shared interest in preserving strategic stability, again, in order to prevent the risk of escalation. Transparently plays a role here, but so to sum it up, I believe arms control risk reduction is sort of a safety valve in a deterrence posture that just needs to be there in addition, not instead of deterrence, but in addition to everything we're doing to prevent intended wars. Now, just very briefly, because you mentioned all these, maybe you could say, iconic arms control deals, which are of a different nature than what I just mentioned, because these are what you may call harder arms control agreements about numerical and or geographic constraints. I think there the picture is indeed does not very good. And the reason, first of all, is because, well, in the bilateral context with Russia, the relationship right now is simply not in a state where talking about any of this would make sense. The second point you already raised yourself is that the geopolitics, the global geopolitics of nuclear arms control has become so much more complex. And we frankly do not really know how to solve this. But I think there's also a third reason that was also already touched upon here, and that is the technological context of arms control, or ideas about arms control, is a lot more complex too. We today have so many more systems that directly affect strategic stability that, of course, from an arms control perspective, makes it a lot, sorry if I use this word, but just messier to even find ways into this and trying to stabilize the situation and finding approaches that works. And since you explicitly mentioned long-range precision strike capabilities, I think they're probably on top of the list of factors that just complicate the prospects for any kind of hard arms control solutions. One last aspect is also that I think in terms of the NATO posture, for example, we don't really know exactly yet where we're headed, right, with the implementation of the new force model and so on. So this is also work in progress, and that maybe in a few years we will have a clear picture.
But if I may, I mean, you have explained all the constraints, the limitations we're faced with. Numbers, the geopolitics, new developments in technology and so on. And it is unlikely we're going to have any breakthroughs in any of these areas. But given that the concerns we all have about misunderstanding, unintended wars, could it be that the Western allies should be more ambitious and more proactive in proposing to Russia and to China, maybe to others, to have at least conversations on risk reduction and confidence building measures, which would not be quantitative and physical, but more going back to that aspect of building at least a shield of confidence in terms of what different countries might be doing, so we don't get into unintended escalation, even though the geopolitics are always going to be there.
Oh, I absolutely do believe so. And it's also happening, right? Maybe not everywhere in the alliance, but it is definitely happening in the United States. I mean, the Sullivan speech last year was mentioned, offering strategic dialogue. There's also a range of military-to-military contacts, for example. I mean, in the the U.S.-China context. And I think one aspect to also remember is that there are actually individual NATO members who have measures in place. I'm thinking about Norway, for example, that could also be useful. But in general, I mean, this is a controversial issue within NATO, as we know. But I do think that this idea that this kind of arms control, that risk reduction would undermine deterrence, is just wrong. This complements deterrence. Arms control is not the opposite of deterrence. It is a safety valve to make sure that measures you take to prevent intended wars do not result in unintended wars.
Okay, thank you very much. We have 9 minutes to take some questions from the floor. Trust me, it's almost impossible to see anything from here. But, okay, I have 4 questions. I'm going to take the first 2 here, and then I'll take the next 2 there. So let me start with these 2 gentlemen here, and then we'll turn on the other side.
Thank you, great panel, really. The question is, do we see a continuity in United States, specifically United States policy towards nuclear deterrence? And in the context of Ukraine, I want to refer to 1991 so-called Chicken Kiev speech by President Bush Sr., who on return from Moscow landed in Kiev and delivered a speech to the Ukrainian Verkhovna Rada parliament, saying that the Ukrainians should abandon their nationalistic dreams and remain and work toward the progress and democracy within the Soviet Union. Well, 3 weeks later they declared independence, didn't pay much attention. But why did he do it? This is one of the questions which pestered us throughout the whole period. That means predictability, stability, and safety of relationship with other, mainly Russia, nuclear powers. I'm finishing. Please. So, is there a continuity until today, or has something changed in the American nuclear posture?
Okay, thank you. Next gentleman, please.
Thank you very much. McDonald Laurier Institute, Canada. 2 very quick questions. As China increases their capabilities and aim to reach about 1,500 nuclear missiles by 2035, which is effectively the same as Americans are deploying, we will have a 3-body problem when it comes to arms control. How to deal with that with the procedures that we have tends to be about dyadic relations with the US and Russia. And the second quick question is how to think about the non-nuclear strategic weapons when it comes to nuclear stability, things like hypersonics, and how you see the development of that affecting nuclear stability. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Amy, I think you go first on the first question.
I can do both of them. I have no idea what prompted George H.W. Bush's Chicken Kiev speech. I remember it well. Don't blame me. It was 30 years ago. Yes, there is extraordinary continuity in U.S. nuclear posture, which makes people in the arms control community really upset. But within the United States, there are just several schools of thought on what our nuclear posture should be, and it moves very slightly between administrations. Sometimes there's a bit of outliers, but there are people at the ends of the range who would like to see massive changes. Never happens. I'd be careful with the China estimates. The intelligence community has said, and I don't have it in front of me, but that 1,500 number is a total stockpile of China warheads if they keep going at the current pace. Our problem is we don't know if they're going to keep going at the current pace. It could go faster, it could go slower. Also, that's total stockpile. The United States total stockpile is up over 3,000 warheads, so do not tell me they are equal. That really annoys me. I can do the math. Also, the United States does not know what China's goals are. So if I'm going to worry about China, I am far more worried about potential changes in doctrine and intent than numbers.
Okay. Let me turn to the 2 persons here on this side. Please.
My name is Jakub Graca. I have a question to Barbara Kunz. You said that the way to win a potential nuclear war is to never wage it. But I have a question because it is a negative premise. So Russia knows that we, the West, that we are afraid of a nuclear war more than Russia is. And shouldn't we rather play along? Shouldn't the West rather turn it into a positive premise, building on the glorious SDI initiative developed by the Reagan administration, and turn the premise we never want to wage a nuclear war into a premise we are ready to, we will develop capabilities to be ready to turn Russia into ashes without the fear of retaliation, because we would be potentially able, if Russia decided to embark on a nuclear war, we would be able to destroy all the Russian delivery systems of.
Okay, thank you. Next, please. There was a person here on this side. Oh, there. Maybe it's here. It's in the back.
A question for Paul Schulte. Is there a talking cure for nuclear anxiety? How should democratic politicians address their peoples? And in fact, how can we best aid our democratic politicians from being frozen by fear?
Okay, Paul, do you want to take those?
I think that's a very good question, and the treatment is still under study. This is a nuclear crisis of the kind that the human race is going to have to confront for the rest of the century, and maybe for centuries beyond. It's the systematic use of nuclear weapons for intimidation, for advantage in a regional territorial crisis. And the stakes involved are huge to some, trivial to others, against the risks which appear disastrous to everyone. How we deal with that, how we find what the right degree of nuclear anxiety is, the sort of healthy level, is still to be decided. There will be some kind of unavoidable democratic conversation about it. Some of the exaggerated symptoms of fear are beginning to look ridiculous, I think. We're settling down now about the degree of terror that Russian threats should inspire in us, but I don't know how it'll work out. It does need to be. We need to understand that that nuclear weapons are being used. We've got to stop the vocabulary which pretends that we're not in a nuclear crisis. This is the Ukraine war cannot be understood in its origins and intentions and the plan for victory that the Russians have without thinking of nuclear weapons. And how we respond to that is something that will have to emerge within democratic societies, ideally with assistance from the sort of strategic community that would be here, and intelligent, determined members of the political classes in all our countries. Well, but I don't know what it's going to be.
We need to stop to let Barbara and Łukasz also have an opportunity to jump in on this, on any of these questions.
Okay, very, very shortly. So you only got one shot at trying nuclear strategy, right? So that's one reason not to be too forward-leaning. And then the second thing, since you mentioned strategic missile defense in the United States, which I know is a very partisan issue in the U.S., the thing is that the law of physics are not partisan, and that people with technical backgrounds, I'm a political scientist myself, but the people I talk to with technical backgrounds tell me that strategic missile defense simply does not work. And so I wouldn't base any strategy on that for that reason.
Yeah, I agree. Nuclear primacy, so the ability to strike and destroy everything, that's been theorized, but never actually implemented as a reasonable policy and strategic goal. And it's just not possible with countries with arsenals like Russia's. The best way to deal with intimidation is not to get intimidated. It's as simple as that. And I think this idea about raising nuclear IQ, so talking more, but in a reasonable terms about nuclear deterrence and uses and aims of having our nuclear arsenals, is one way of making sure that next time the decision makers hear about Russian nuclear exercise, they don't start screaming. Again, it's just not just the decision makers, it's also the media, it's also our social media sphere, to just make sure that we are not scared in a situation that we shouldn't be scared.
Thank you very much. Amy, Paul, Barbara, Łukasz, thank you very much for your contributions to this debate.
Diego, thank you very much. I would like to invite you to follow up on some things. So you do not win nuclear wars. That was a strong statement. What's your takeaway from the discussion? Are we doing enough to enhance the nuclear deterrence?
Well, I'm pleased that we cover a lot of different bases, from the physical to the psychological. We spoke about credibility. We spoke about capacity. We spoke about the nuclear conventional interface, the relationship of France to the other allies, and we ended up on issues about confidence building, risk reduction, and lastly, maybe the whole issue of how you don't get intimidated and how you resist intimidation and coercion. And I think all of that shows how nuclear strategy has to be a central aspect of everything we do, because wherever we turn to, the war in Ukraine, the crisis over Taiwan, North Korea, the Middle East with Iran, and the Red Sea, the nuclear shadow is there everywhere.
Absolutely, yeah.
Diego, thank you very much for moderating this panel.
Thank you.